Hello my friends, Devaun Lennox here, PhotographyPX.com. In today's video, I want to cover the difference between DNG and RAW. We'll cover what each file format is, along with the advantages and disadvantages of both of these formats. I'll also discuss some of the practical use cases for one format over the other. So by the end of the video, you'll have some valuable insight about each of these file types and which is best for your workflow. Note you can find timestamps in the description down below, and you can also scrub through the video to skip to a more relevant section if you'd like. But with that said, let's get started. DNG versus RAW is often a question that many photographers ask about, and ultimately photographers want to know which format is best. But it's also important to question what exactly is the difference between RAW and DNG files, and is there even a difference? Well, there is a difference, and there are quite a few, in fact, despite both of these files serving the same general function. But let's first cover what each file format is, starting with the RAW file. A RAW file is your camera's native file format that contains all the unprocessed data from its sensor. Contrary to what many may think, the RAW file isn't a visual file format though. Instead, it's a raster file with raw data of the analog to digital conversion process, or put another way, it's the values your camera recorded as it converted light into a voltage. That process goes like this. Light enters through the lens, then reaches the sensor, then strikes each of its photodiodes on each pixel. When that happens, the camera converts the recorded intensity into an electrical charge using its processor, and it records each pixel across all its 24 million pixels on the sensor, or whatever the resolution of your camera is. It then combines all of these values into an uncompressed readout encoded as binary data, which is ones and zeros, into a single file, which it shoots out to the memory card. So in the end, a RAW file really stores data, not a picture per se, and it merely contains information about how much light was recorded in either the red, blue, or green color spectrums over the time of exposure. But since it stores the most detail and image data of all raster file types, it's a common choice amongst digital cameras, image scanners, and even film scanners. And the basic idea with RAW is to give photographers the most detail and freedom to control how the final image appears once it's processed. But it's important to point out though that each RAW file type is proprietary to both the camera manufacturer and often the specific camera model, and that actually becomes a huge downside to this format, as we'll discuss later in this video. With RAW covered though, let's move over to the DNG file. But quick commercial break. Did you know PhotographyPX launched a sister company called PXPresets.com? Well, if you didn't, PXPresets.com is going to be your next one-stop shop for Adobe Lightroom desktop and mobile presets. On PX Presets, you can find a large selection of presets to shortcut the process of getting high quality images and consistent branding across your imagery. We have a large selection of styles that are well suited for food, products, portraiture, fashion, beauty, and much more. We're also running a special right now for our mega collection, so if you want to upgrade your entire workflow in one fell swoop, now's a great opportunity. If you're in the market for some high quality Lightroom presets to shortcut your workflow, feel free to check out pxpresets.com. With that said, back to the video. I mentioned earlier that RAW files are camera manufacturer and even camera model specific, and that means that they're all slightly different despite having the same overarching file extension attached at the end of the file, say Sony.arw. And in 2004, Adobe found the influx of new undocumented RAW files quite frustrating. So much so they launched the digital negative or DNG file specification that year, developed on the TIFF6 format. Like RAW, DNG is an uncompressed raster file that captures all the sensor information at the time of exposure. Doing so ensures you capture the maximum image quality your camera provides. However, unlike most RAW formats, it's an open source alternative, so anyone can use it without paying a licensing fee, and it's generic and highly compatible with most editors, unlike traditional RAW files which require dedicated software support. The intention of DNG was to encourage camera manufacturers to adopt the format and offer it as an option, or even better, the default file format in camera. Doing so would standardize it amongst the camera industry and level the playing field. Crucially, it would also eliminate the proprietary technologies used to capture the RAW format, and that would also solve key compatibility issues, like forcing developers to constantly update their image editing software with each new camera release, which usually takes several months. And of course, we can't forget to mention it would start a new area of domination for Adobe, which surely would have been lucrative for them. And indeed, it would also make it easy for them specifically to update and develop their software for each new camera, saving them time, effort, and money. But that didn't happen. And sadly, the DNG file format isn't standardized today. Instead, only a handful of manufacturers offer this file in camera, namely Sigma, Ricoh, Hasselblad, and Leica. For everyone else, including the key players like Nikon, Canon, and Sony, you'll have to use a DNG converter to unlock its benefits. Thankfully, you can convert most RAW files immediately upon import into Adobe Lightroom or using Adobe's free DNG converter. So at the very least, it's a straightforward process. With that said, what are the advantages of DNG and why bother with the potential hassle of converting to DNG in the first place if it's rather faintly adopted by most camera manufacturers? Well, there are practical reasons to do so, but the first and arguably biggest strength of DNG is its archiving and future compatibility. When it comes to archiving your old photos, DNG files are more recognizable and accessible than RAW. This format is also open source so that any software company can establish support for it in the future. This is great news because you have better third-party compatibility with the DNG format since they don't require a proprietary decoding algorithm to interpolate the raw data. Thus, you have broader support amongst other third-party photo editors, not just Adobe's Creative Cloud Suite. For example, GIMP and Darktable support DNGs, and both of these software applications are free. There are also plenty of paid editors like Affinity Photo, Capture One, Exposure X6, DxO's Photolab, and ON1's Photo Raw that also support this format too. As such, the DNG format becomes a better long-term safe bet if your camera manufacturer were to go out of business. At least if that were to happen, you wouldn't lose support for your older RAW files in the process and have difficulty opening them like what Kodak has done with their particular files. Next, the DNG file format offers built-in checksum validation. Unlike RAW, checksum validation is a rigorous checklist that's used to validate its authenticity and spot image data changes that otherwise corrupt images. And that's great news if you're worried about dealing with a corrupt RAW file, so now you can have some peace of mind during the image culling process. As a bonus, you can also run this validation script across an entire library of images, making it incredibly easy to spot corrupted files. And it's a must if you're moving a library from one storage source, say your computer, to another, say an external hard drive. Granted, I want to point out that this process doesn't prevent corruption itself, but at least it provides a tool you can use to spot it when it does happen. Next, DNG files are smaller and take up less storage space. The DNG format is more compact than RAW, and merely converting a RAW photo can provide a 15 to 20% reduction in file size depending on your camera model. Yet they maintain the same image quality and also include a medium quality JPEG preview to boot. There's even an option to apply lossy compression and remove the JPEG preview altogether, further decreasing their file size. Together, the smaller file size makes this format ideal for storing large archives or situations where your computer is limited on storage as it requires less overall space. Next, DNGs are easier to edit. It's important that I mention here the edits you make in Lightroom aren't actually stored in a RAW file. Instead, RAW files have a sidecar or a separate .xmp file containing all the settings, changes, or edits you make. This is great since it means the original file is left untouched, but it also means that every edited RAW file gets stored as two separate files, and that in turn complicates how easily you can edit the files later, as you'll need the original XMP file to recall any previous edits. With DNG files, however, the edits and changes get written into the file itself, leading to fewer files to store overall and manage. And it also makes editing photos easier since the changes are stored internally. Now, while these advantages of DNG all sound fantastic, it's not without its problems, so let's cover the most important cons of this file format right now. Arguably, the most crucial downside is the amount of time it takes to convert from RAW to DNG. Since most cameras don't shoot DNG natively, this format nearly always requires tackling the conversion process, which then requires a computer. Thankfully, Adobe's Lightroom can do this automatically during import. It's just a matter of enabling that option. Even so, depending on your computer's processing speed, the number of files you have to convert, and your camera's resolution, it could take a significant amount of time nonetheless. Most files take up to 10 seconds or less to convert, but that 10 seconds adds up. If you have, say, a shoot of 500 images, we're talking 83 minutes to convert here. And this extra time it takes to import could be a deal breaker if you have a high-speed editing workflow, say you're shooting sports, wildlife, or photojournalism. And this downside alone is worth reconsidering to some photographers. Next, DNG doesn't work with most first-party manufacturers' software. So Nikon's Capture NX, Fujifilm's X-RAW Studio, or Sony's Imaging Edge all won't read DNGs. The only way to use these tools is by embedding the original RAW file into the DNG itself upon conversion, but unfortunately that doubles the file size and removes one of the key advantages to this file format altogether. That process is also not guaranteed to work. So if you prefer using your camera manufacturer's editing software, you may want to skip DNG altogether. Next, the DNG conversion can remove some important metadata from the original file, and some camera-specific metadata is lost during the conversion if it's not recognized correctly. And sadly, it's impossible to recover that information afterward. This metadata may include the focus point, picture controls, shutter type, GPS data, and copyright information. Adobe claims that all metadata is retained during the conversion, but that's not always the case. So it's wise to test this for yourself to see if it applies to your specific camera make and model. And it may be best to use RAW files if it does, as they'll maintain all of your original EXIF data. Lastly, this file format is a bit risky and the backup process does take quite some time. Saving a change to a DNG requires creating a new DNG file altogether, since they lack the XMP sidecar files that RAW files have. So every change that saves needs a whole new file, and this slows down both the speed of backing up files and editing images to a certain extent. It's mainly a problem if you work with multiple editors on a single image, as it requires them to have the original DNG files to make changes. For RAW, however, you could merely upload a small sidecar XMP file, saving well over 30 megabytes of uploading space and a lot of time in that process. So if you're part of a retouching agency or commercial team, using RAW is best to avoid the hassle of transferring DNGs, but more importantly, since the changes are recorded into the DNG file itself, you increase the chance of file corruption by continually editing it. With every edit, the more likely it'll eventually become corrupt, and this is quite concerning as you'll lose not only the original edits, but also the entire file itself. Even worse if you embed the RAW file. At least with RAW alone, if the sidecar is corrupted, you can still have the original file intact. So the best means to solve this problem is by backing up both the converted DNG and the original RAW files separately. Granted though, that will remove all of the file saving benefits in the process. So to conclude, should you use DNG or RAW? As with many things, the answer isn't black or white, but for now, it's not immediately necessary to convert your photo library to DNG, since most camera manufacturers on the market have adequate support for their RAW files. But it may be something to consider long-term if you have concerns about reviewing images from much older cameras. It's also something to consider if you've experienced a major operating system update recently, say Apple's M1 architecture, that causes a slew of software to become obsolete at once. Then that would be an excellent opportunity to convert your existing library, as Adobe will continue delivering updates to this ecosystem. Granted, you will potentially lose some original metadata in that process, but in the end though, Adobe had great intentions with the DNG format, but it didn't quite dominate the photography community as planned. Still, it's a format that I use because we work with so many different cameras and RAW formats, and it's simply too inconvenient otherwise. Still, it's a shame to see it not become more standardized across all of the camera manufacturers. Instead, it's yet another file format out there and yet another decision to make. Thankfully, despite not being adopted by the biggest camera manufacturers, it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So if it works for your workflow, it is a great option, especially if you only edit with Adobe products, and at least you now have a much better understanding of how it can benefit you.